Kyiv was never supposed to become unvisitable. Not Kyiv, the symbolic heart of Ukraine's resistance, the city that held concerts in subway shelters and rallied diplomats on its defiant boulevards. But now, for the first time since the full-scale war began, Western governments are quietly whispering a phrase that sends shivers through the corridors of international aid agencies and diplomatic missions: no-go zone. Welcome back to What If Horizons, where we push past the headlines and into the dangerous questions nobody wants to ask in public. Today's thought experiment is not a far-off fantasy. It's something that might be decided in a NATO conference room or on a secure Zoom call between Brussels and Washington any day now. What if Kyiv becomes a no-go zone for Western aid? The immediate spark for this thought came from fire and steel. A recent Russian aerial onslaught on Kyiv's Solomiansky district, the most brutal this year, killed 28 civilians and injured over 130 others. A 9-story apartment building crumbled into itself like a sandcastle under artillery rain. The death toll might have been even worse if not for sheer luck. But here's the new pattern. As emergency workers were pulling bodies from the rubble, more drones kept coming. More explosions. More delays. Kyiv's rescue services have now become dual-purpose, part ambulance, part duck and cover. This isn't just about horror. It's about operability. When a city's aid workers can't finish a shift without running for cover, when diplomats stop holding in-person meetings, when the air defense umbrella starts to resemble Swiss cheese, then Kyiv stops functioning as a safe zone. Then the talk begins. Not officially, of course. No country wants to say on record that its embassy personnel are packing their bags. No NGO wants to admit they're weighing whether to reroute supplies through Lviv or Rzeszów. And certainly, no Western leader wants to appear to be abandoning Ukraine, just as the Russian war machine seems to be recalibrating for urban destruction. But in backrooms and briefings, the whispers have started. And that's where we come in. Because while public discourse clings to hope, strategic planners deal in worst-case scenarios. What happens if Western embassies close shop in Kyiv? Not just temporarily, but indefinitely. If NGOs and humanitarian workers are told, you can no longer safely operate in the capital, what does that do to the war effort, the morale, the global narrative? Would the symbolism of Kyiv, a city that has been Ukraine's diplomatic and emotional lifeline, suddenly turn from defiance to fragility? And here's a harder question. Could the West still support Ukraine meaningfully from a distance? Or does physically leaving Kyiv mean morally checking out? Strap in, because we're about to explore a scenario where the world's most watched war takes an invisible but seismic turn, away from the front lines and into the diplomatic shadows. And like every good What If Horizons episode, we'll go deep, not just into military calculations, but into the psychology of withdrawal, the optics of fear, and the thin line between prudence and abandonment. Next, we'll walk through the brutal numbers and cascading aftershocks of the recent strike that turned Kyiv's skies into a death zone. But as always, don't look away. The future might just be flying overhead. Let's start with the facts that no press conference can sanitize. The June strike on Kyiv was not just another statistic in the long, cruel ledger of this war. It was a transformation event. 440 drones, 32 missiles, a synchronized assault designed not only to overwhelm air defenses, but to saturate them, to prove that even the crown jewel of Ukraine's resilience could be brought to its knees. Kyiv's Solomiansky district, once a middle-class neighborhood with schools and markets, was left unrecognizable. One 9-story apartment complex collapsed outright, its skeleton exposed like an autopsy in concrete. 28 people died, among them children and elderly civilians. Over 130 more were injured, many pulled from the wreckage only hours later, because, yes, rescue operations were paused due to incoming waves of drones. Let that detail linger for a moment. Rescue workers had to stop pulling the wounded from the rubble because new strikes were incoming. This wasn't war. It was a message, and the message landed. Fast. Foreign correspondents, who had long made Kyiv their base of operations, began tweeting from safer cities. Some NGO staffers discreetly shifted back to Lviv, justifying it as logistical recalibration. Embassies increased private security measures and started classifying meeting locations. Diplomats, those ultimate creatures of protocol and posturing, began to cancel in-person events, citing air traffic disruptions, when everyone knew exactly what those disruptions were made of. And behind the scenes? Panic. Controlled, professional panic, but panic nonetheless. Because for all the talk of Ukraine's battlefield successes, Western engagement depends heavily on a functional Kyiv. That's where plans are drawn, aid is distributed, reporters get their briefings, and alliances are symbolically affirmed. Kyiv is the war's diplomatic anchor. If it goes dark, everything else wobbles. And now it's wobbling. Governments are quietly revisiting internal threat assessments. They're cross-referencing missile flight paths with embassy coordinates. NGOs are having long, tense Zoom calls about evacuation protocols. Humanitarian organizations are triaging not just aid recipients, but staff. Who can stay? Who has families back home? Who's too essential to pull out? And who's too irreplaceable to risk? All of this, mind you, is still unofficial. No flag has yet been lowered. But we've seen this play before: Baghdad, Kabul, Aleppo. The pattern always starts the same: a catastrophic attack, followed by security concerns, followed by the gradual disappearance of foreign personnel, as if they're melting into the air. What makes Kyiv different is the stakes. This isn't just another city under siege. It's the beating heart of Europe's most symbolic war since 1945. And if it becomes unworkable, unlivable, unvisitable by Western actors, then the message to Moscow is simple: keep bombing, and you can bomb the West out of the war without firing a shot at them directly. Let's not underestimate the psychological shift either. Kyiv has been the place where foreign dignitaries stroll in for photo ops in bulletproof vests, where Zelensky meets visiting prime ministers under chandeliers salvaged from Soviet architecture. If that stage goes dark, so does part of the West's narrative. But what does it actually mean to call a capital city a no-go zone? And what precedent does the world have for such a designation? In the next segment, we'll unpack that term, compare it to history's other diplomatic retreats, and explore what makes Kyiv's moment uniquely dangerous. Ready? Because the phrase no-go zone doesn't mean no hope, but it always means something big is already lost. Let's talk about that phrase, no-go zone. It sounds clinical, bureaucratic, maybe even a little overused in media cycles. But make no mistake, when those words appear in diplomatic cables or NGO advisories, they are a red siren wrapped in legalese. So what actually defines a no-go zone in the context of war? It's not just about bombs falling. Plenty of cities endure bombardment without losing their international presence. It's a specific threshold, a toxic brew of persistent threats, degraded infrastructure, and the evaporating illusion of control. It's when your security team says, "We can't guarantee safe passage to the airport anymore." When embassies stop hosting receptions and start shredding documents. When governments issue level 4 travel advisories and your insurance provider won't cover your field medic. Kyiv is rapidly approaching those thresholds. First, persistent threats. The attacks are no longer sporadic or geographically limited. They are systemic, calculated, and relentless. Air raid sirens used to be background noise. Now, they're predictive. Foreign staffers time their coffee breaks around them. You can't run an aid program on instinct and luck. Second, overwhelmed defenses. Ukraine's anti-air systems are formidable, yes, but they're not omnipotent. And lately, they're being tested beyond design limits. When 440 drones and dozens of missiles come in one night, and some of them get through, that's not just an operational concern. That's a political signal. And air defense is like reputation. It only takes a few failures for trust to collapse. Third, evacuation logistics. This is the most sobering part. Right now, if a Western embassy ordered an emergency evacuation, it's unclear how efficiently that could happen. Airspace is closed. Roads are vulnerable. Railways are crowded and increasingly targeted. You need corridors. You need timing. You need guarantees. And none of those things are solid right now. It doesn't stop with risk assessments either. The dominoes fall quickly once the label no-go zone becomes reality. First come the diplomats. Quietly, respectfully, and sometimes tearfully, they leave. They'll say it's temporary. They'll say they're relocating to Lviv or Warsaw for logistical reasons. But once they're gone, they're gone. Flags come down. Staff are rotated. The symbolic vacuum grows. Then the NGOs, the field hospitals, the food distribution networks, the trauma therapists. the advisors helping to reform Ukraine's energy grid and education system. They don't leave with a parade. They disappear over weeks, often without press releases. Some shift to remote ops. Others suspend operations entirely. Aid doesn't vanish, but it thins. It slows. It bureaucratizes. A child who got a blanket in 48 hours now waits 2 weeks. This is not conjecture. This is what happened in Baghdad after the UN headquarters was bombed. In Aleppo when the last aid convoys pulled out. In Kabul as embassies shut down overnight. The logic is always the same. If you can't protect your people, you pull them out. But here's the key difference. Kyiv isn't a sideshow in the war, it is the stage. If it's no longer accessible to the West, then what does that say about the West's commitment? What happens to the symbolic power of standing with Ukraine when no one is physically there to stand? We're not there yet, but we're inching closer. And if the next barrage is deadlier, or if a foreign envoy gets injured, or if an evacuation goes wrong, the shift from heavily restricted to no-go zone could happen within hours. The next part of our story is the hardest to hear. What happens to Ukraine? Its people, its politics, its battlefield prospects, if that Western presence disappears. Because for Ukraine, this isn't just about logistics. It's about survival. Let's play the scenario forward. It's a Tuesday morning in Kyiv. Another overnight drone barrage hits the Obolonsky and Podol districts. Several Western workers are caught in the blast radius, not dead, but seriously injured. One of them is from a Scandinavian aid group. Another is a U.S. State Department advisor. Their names trend on social media before official confirmations even arrive. The embassies go quiet. Then they light up. Emergency meetings. Flights booked. Convoys assembled. Within 48 hours, the cascade begins. First, the embassies issue authorized departure notices, allowing non-essential staff and families to leave voluntarily. That's the soft launch. Then comes the full-scale drawdown, ordered departure. Personnel are flown out, sometimes under armed escort. The fortified compounds along Yaroslav Val and Mykolivska Street are shuttered. Flags are lowered. Security contractors pack up comms gear and destroy hard drives. You won't see it broadcast, but it's the loudest silence Ukraine will hear since the first day of the invasion. At the same time, the NGO sector starts fracturing. Aid groups already stretched thin now have to operate from Lviv, Rzeszów, or even Berlin. On-the-ground assessments become satellite reports. Psychosocial programs are suspended. Refugee centers run by local Ukrainian partners begin rationing supplies because the logistics flow is clogged by bureaucracy and fear. Then, the programs stop entirely. Medical clinics in Kyiv's outer suburbs, some of the only places where elderly patients could get chronic care, shut down. Supply chains break not because they lack supplies, but because there's no one to distribute them. Food aid to inner-city shelters slows to a trickle. Wounded civilians begin dying from treatable injuries, not because of malice, but because of distance. And the reconstruction effort, what had been slowly rebuilding schools, roads, water systems, is halted. Cement sits unused. Engineers leave. Architectural renderings yellow in UN laptops. But this isn't just about logistics. The consequences echo in Ukraine's political and military core. Without those international diplomats, Ukraine's government loses a vital channel of informal leverage. There's no one to walk the halls of the Verkhovna Rada with US or EU credibility in their back pocket. There's no one to whisper in ministers' ears about the next tranche of aid, or to apply pressure on anti-corruption reforms, or to signal quiet solidarity after a political scandal. Ukraine becomes a talking point in foreign capitals, not a partner. And on the battlefield, that absence echoes, too. Military aid may still arrive, but without Western observers and logistical staff in country, oversight gets muddled. Coordination slows. Intelligence sharing degrades. Morale among Ukraine's troops suffers, not because the weapons vanish, but because the sense of global solidarity erodes. Commanders begin to wonder, are we being left to bleed alone again? And as all this happens, Russia tightens its grip on the narrative. Kremlin media declares victory, not militarily, but psychologically. The West abandoned Kyiv, they'll say. They talk about support, but flee at the first sign of real danger. It doesn't even have to be true. It just has to be plausible. That's the game. For European publics, especially those already wavering on further support, It becomes harder to argue that Kyiv should get more when even Western diplomats won't step foot in the capital. NATO officials struggle to explain why American, British, or German citizens should fund a war effort in a city their own governments won't enter. Ukraine, once the emotional heart of a global resistance, starts to look like a liability. That's the true weight of a no-go designation. It's not just a red circle on a map. It's a slow hemorrhage of relevance, trust, and hope. But don't mistake this for surrender. Ukrainians will continue fighting. The question is, will anyone still be standing beside them? Or just watching from far, far away? In the next segment, we turn outward. What ripple effects would a Western pullout from Kyiv have across the global chessboard, from Brussels to Beijing? Step outside Ukraine's borders, and the shockwaves start to spread fast. When Kyiv becomes a no-go zone for Western aid, the question isn't just what happens in Ukraine. It becomes, who fills the void, and at what cost? Let's begin with the humanitarian fallout. As Western aid workers evacuate and programs freeze, the people who suffer most aren't on the news. They're the quiet majority, elderly pensioners surviving on UN food baskets, kids in trauma clinics funded by EU grants, women escaping occupied zones who now find the safe houses closed, the therapists gone. Hospitals like Akhmetdit, the National Children's Hospital recently hit, lose foreign medical volunteers. Vaccination programs stumble. Life-saving supplies like insulin or cancer medication get delayed, misrouted, or forgotten entirely. The chaos isn't always visible. It's not always bloody, but it's deadly in the long term. The psychological toll can't be overstated. If Kyiv is declared unsafe even for the global community, what message does that send to Ukrainians? To the soldiers digging trenches, the teachers still holding classes in metro stations, the mayors coordinating water access under missile fire? It whispers something corrosive: you're on your own. But the collapse of humanitarian channels is only the first domino. Political and military consequences follow fast and hard. Diplomatically, Kyiv becomes a vacuum. Foreign embassies closing or operating remotely means Ukraine's voice is now filtered through second-hand accounts. There's no one to see the war up close, no one to attend funerals, visit bomb sites, talk to displaced families in person. Western policymakers are left with distance and spreadsheets. And when policymakers are distanced, commitment weakens. Aid packages stall in parliaments. Defense ministers grow cautious. EU councils shift focus toward other crises: climate, migration, Taiwan. In the media, Ukraine loses airtime. It's still a war, but now it's a stale one. Militarily, there's another cost: morale. Much of Ukraine's battlefield resilience has been psychological, rooted in a sense that the free world stands behind them. Western boots on the ground, even if they're not fighting, signal that someone is watching, someone cares. Remove that presence, and the sense of isolation creeps in. Ukrainian commanders know how to fight, but logistics, coordination, intelligence, that's often where Western support is most vital and most invisible. If Kyiv becomes unviable for these actors, coordination fragments. Supplies move slower. Missions misalign. Targets go unmarked. And then there's the enemy. Russia. Putin has always treated perception as a weapon. If the West pulls out of Kyiv, he'll weaponize the image with chilling efficiency. Kremlin media will show abandoned embassies. They'll show empty UN offices, faded NATO stickers on closed doors. They'll say, the West doesn't believe in Ukraine anymore. Why should you? It won't matter if weapons keep flowing. What matters is the optics, and Russia has built an empire on optics. Meanwhile, NATO nations feel the tremor. Poland, the Baltics, even Germany, they watch closely. If Kyiv is too dangerous, how far is Lviv? How safe is the Suwalki Gap? Confidence in NATO resolve starts to erode not because Article 5 is tested, but because Article reality kicks in. And beyond Europe, China sees a distracted, fragmented West. It watches Washington and Brussels falter in Ukraine and wonders what that means for Taiwan. Iran interprets it as Western fatigue. Dictators everywhere quietly celebrate. The danger isn't just that Kyiv becomes a no-go zone. It's that the symbolic capital of the free world becomes a blank spot on the map, abandoned not by weakness, but by calculation. Because even the most principled democracies have limits. The question is, what happens when defending freedom means entering a city your own risk assessments tell you to avoid? Up next, We zoom out even further. Could remote strategies, like drone aid or satellite diplomacy, ever replace a real presence on the ground? Or is the human element irreplaceable in war and peace alike? Now, let's zoom out from Kyiv and look at the domino effect across the region and the world. First, the diplomatic aftershocks. As Western personnel evacuate Kyiv, every capital in Europe recalibrates its strategy. Poland, Slovakia, Romania, all frontline NATO members, now sit closer to a war without the buffer of a functioning Ukrainian capital supported by on-the-ground allies. In Brussels, the EU leadership scrambles. Some nations push to double down, send more support remotely, fund tech-based operations, ramp up sanctions. Others, already facing electoral pressure and inflation, quietly begin pressing for negotiations. A few even explore off-ramps. Not peace, but de-escalation. The cracks widen. At the United Nations, chaos deepens. Russia vetoes any resolution that criticizes its actions. Western nations condemn Moscow's escalation but can't agree on how to respond. Debates spiral between calls for humanitarian corridors and accusations of hypocrisy. And meanwhile, the UN's own agencies lose access to the ground. Reporting becomes patchy, data unreliable, photos unverifiable. Kyiv goes dark, not from blackout bombs, but from the absence of truth. And then, Russia makes its move. The Kremlin interprets Western withdrawal not as a strategic reshuffle, but as surrender in slow motion. Without observers or watchdogs, Russia ramps up missile strikes across central Ukraine. More Iranian drones, more hypersonics, more use of glide bombs in dense urban areas. They don't stop at military targets. They target morale. And without foreign personnel in Kyiv, there's no one to witness the full scope. No photojournalists on the ground. No international staff in hospitals. No diplomats to tour the rubble. Russia exploits that invisibility with brutal confidence. Next, economic warfare intensifies. Russian cyber units hit Ukrainian energy grids just as summer strains the infrastructure. Grain exports choke up again. Odessa ports threatened not just by sea mines, but by bureaucratic fear. Global food prices spike. North African nations dependent on Ukrainian wheat brace for shortages. Riots ignite in Cairo, Tunis, Dakar. The West starts seeing the war not just as a regional crisis, but a global supply chain nightmare. Oil prices edge up as fears of Russian retaliation in the Baltic Sea rise. Energy traders react to every drone strike near infrastructure. Insurance premiums for cargo ships in the Black Sea skyrocket. Markets twitch like over-caffeinated rabbits. Meanwhile, Russia extends a diplomatic hand, through China, through India, through the global south. Lavrov tours Africa again. Moscow presents itself as the rational player. We don't want escalation, they say. We want peace, just not NATO's version. And it starts to work. In Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in parts of Africa, the narrative starts to shift. Why is Kyiv unsafe for Europeans, but still good enough for Ukrainians to die in? Why won't the West negotiate? Maybe Russia has a point. It's not because these countries believe the Kremlin. It's because the optics of Western abandonment start to outpace its justifications. At the same time, new calls emerge. Create humanitarian corridors. Establish safe zones. Negotiate a demilitarized capital. But who enforces these things when no one's on the ground? Who verifies anything? The NGOs are gone. The embassies are closed. Kyiv has become an information desert, a fog of war capital. Back in Washington and London, analysts worry about a worst-case chain reaction. What if the vacuum in Kyiv becomes the template for future hybrid wars? What if urban no-go zones become the norm for every authoritarian advance? Cities bombed into diplomatic exile, civilian life turned invisible for the convenience of geopolitical negotiation. And so we ask, was withdrawing from Kyiv the safer move, or the first step in abandoning the idea of international presence altogether? Next, we'll examine whether remote aid, via drones, satellites, encrypted calls, can truly replace the physical presence of Western actors, or if some things, especially trust, only happen eye to eye, on the ground, in the rubble. Let's now turn to the question Western strategists are desperately hoping has a favorable answer. Can remote support replace physical presence in Kyiv? The short answer? Technologically, yes, partially. But emotionally, Politically and strategically, it's murky at best. First, the tools. Western governments and NGOs have increasingly adopted remote aid technologies over the past decade. Drones can deliver medical supplies. Encrypted satellite links allow real-time communication with local partners. Surveillance balloons, satellites, and ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, planes can still monitor battlefield shifts from afar. AI-assisted analysis can even flag potential war crimes using heat signatures, trajectory mapping, and social media cross-referencing. It sounds futuristic and effective. But here's the catch. You can't algorithm your way into trust. When a Ukrainian civilian sees a drone drop a medical box, it's a miracle. But when no one shows up at the clinic to explain what's inside, or help apply it to a bleeding child, the miracle becomes a mystery. Remote support is efficient, but it's emotionally hollow. It cannot offer presence, reassurance, or judgment in real time. And what about diplomacy? Can an ambassador negotiate a ceasefire over Zoom? Can peace talks take place in a bunker-turned-video studio, with interpreters buffering mid-sentence and missile sirens drowning out translation? Remote diplomacy has limits. In war zones, credibility is half body language, half bravery. If a Western envoy won't risk standing in the same space as the leader they're trying to support, why would anyone else? Then there's security coordination. Remote intelligence sharing still functions. Satellite images don't care if there's a diplomat in Kyiv or not. But targeting, deconfliction, logistics for weapons deliveries, all these require trust between operators on the ground. Pull the human element out of the field, and coordination slows, splinters, or stops entirely. Local NGOs report that without embedded Western staff, even basic aid delivery becomes a maze of permission slips and mistrust. Ukrainian administrators, already overwhelmed, now have to second-guess whether the promised aid will arrive, whether those promised dollars haven't been reallocated to a different crisis, a different capital, a different political mood. Worse, the optics are demoralizing. Russian propaganda quickly seizes on every instance of Western absence. Telegram channels erupt with footage of empty NGO offices, shuttered embassies, and vacant diplomatic cars, overlaid with triumphant music and captions reading, "The West has left you." That narrative cuts deeper than any drone strike. It says, you are on your own. And yet, there are defenders of the remote model. Some argue that concentrating resources in Poland, Germany, or Romania could streamline operations, removing the risk of hostage situations or high-profile casualties. Smart aid becomes the buzzword. Fewer people in danger, more tech in play. But smart aid can become soulless aid. It risks turning Ukraine into a case study, not a cause. It may satisfy parliaments, but it does little to lift morale in shelled neighborhoods or inspire confidence in frontline trenches. Ultimately, the deeper question is not technological, it's philosophical. Do Western values require showing up? Or is virtual solidarity enough in an age where drones do the delivering and algorithms do the witnessing? And if we start accepting virtual presence as a substitute for moral presence, what does that say about the future of conflict, of commitment, and of consequence? Next, we reach our what-if moment. What if Kyiv is left to stand alone, not just in rubble, but in silence, and that silence echoes louder than any explosion? Stay with us. What if Kyiv becomes a ghost capital, not just physically battered, but politically and morally abandoned? What if the last foreign diplomat boards a helicopter under darkness, the final NGO convoy exits through the Polish border, and Kyiv falls silent? Not because it surrendered, but because the world stopped showing up. This is the what-if moment. Not a hypothetical anymore, but a rapidly emerging horizon. Imagine the psychological shift. In war, symbolism often matters more than statistics. The moment Kyiv is labeled a no-go zone, a subtle but powerful message is broadcast. This city is no longer defendable, no longer livable, no longer worth the risk. To Ukraine's defenders, it could feel like the beginning of the end. Even if weapons still flow, if Western leaders no longer visit, no longer walk its streets in defiance, what message does that send to the soldiers in the trenches outside Bakhmut or Kupiansk? What message does it send to the families burying their loved ones beneath the rubble of Solomiansky? Worse still, what if this abandonment becomes contagious? Other Ukrainian cities, Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkiv, may start to wonder whether they're next on the invisible retreat list. Foreign presence evaporates. Aid gets routed elsewhere. The sense of shared struggle collapses into a fragmented, hollow shell. From Moscow's perspective, it's a dream scenario. Not because it captures Kyiv militarily, but because it isolates Ukraine psychologically. Putin doesn't need to plant a flag in Maidan Square. He just needs to make it too dangerous for Westerners to care. That's the power of terror, not just in destroying buildings, but in reshaping global resolve. Now widen the lens. What if this sets a precedent? What if autocracies around the world learn that you don't need to defeat the West? You just need to outlast its willingness to stay. Beijing watches. Tehran watches. Even lesser powers with big ambitions start to internalize the model. Bomb soft targets. Make it unsafe. Wait for the embassies to leave, the cameras to turn off, the NGOs to reassign their staff. It becomes a formula, not just a tactic. And Kyiv is the test case. But let's not forget the opposite. What if is still in play? What if, despite everything, the West doesn't leave? What if diplomats keep their posts, humanitarians keep delivering aid by flashlight under fire, journalists keep telling the story in real time, even as missiles arc over the skyline? That kind of presence, irrational, dangerous, resolute, could change the narrative, could prove that democracy doesn't just live in policy papers and sanctions, but in sweat, sacrifice, and stubborn boots on shattered pavement. That's the crossroads Kyiv faces. And by extension, the world. Abandonment or defiance. Retreat or resolve. Silence or presence. What if this moment defines not just the fate of a city, but the credibility of everything the West claims to believe in? In our final part, we'll wrap up and ask you the question that matters most. Stay with us. Let's take a breath, because this isn't just about geopolitics anymore. This is about how far we're willing to go for the things we say we value. Kyiv stands today as both a battlefield and a symbol, a front line not just between Russia and Ukraine, but between indifference and commitment, between cowardice and courage. If Kyiv becomes a no-go zone, it isn't merely about logistics. It's a test of will, a stress test for democracy, and maybe the clearest window into the moral spine of the West in our time. So we ask plainly, what if Western governments decide the cost is too high? What if presidents and prime ministers, after late-night briefings and sobering casualty reports, sign off on withdrawal orders? No more convoys, no more embassies, no more boots on the ground, just statements, virtual pledges, and solidarity in the form of high-resolution satellite imagery. Would Ukraine's spirit survive that abandonment? Would its army still believe the free world is behind it? Would its people, those who have stood in bread lines, patched their homes with tarps, kissed their children goodbye before heading to the front, still believe their suffering has meaning? Now flip it. What if Western leaders decide not to leave? What if the French ambassador chooses to stay, the UN aid convoy rolls through debris, and the US embassy reaffirms its Kyiv post no matter the risk? That choice would echo louder than any press conference. It would say, we're here, not just in arms shipments or headlines, but here, with you, in your streets, in your danger, in your hope. And that presence could do more than any drone or missile. It could convince Ukrainians and the world that this war isn't just about borders. It's about values, about the soul of international order, about proving that democracies don't fold when terror knocks at the door. But none of this is guaranteed. The next air raid could shift the calculus. The next election, the next budget crisis, the next headline could erode support. Kyiv's fate hangs not just in the balance of military power, but in the attention span and moral clarity of nations watching from afar. So we end this episode not with certainty, but with a question. What if this is the moment that defines whether Western resolve is real, or just rhetoric? Will we show up when it's hardest, or quietly disappear when it matters most? That's a question only time, and the choices we make right now, can answer.